This section?
Yes.
That was the one time of the day.
Adrian and Ross will have the mics. But we have to ask if they want powerful. We'll have to.
John, let's hear how you sound.
Yeah, that's not the word.
Dark in the
Testing, testing sound. Hello? Johannes, testing.
Ask them before they leave the theater today.
Hello, testing 1, 2, 3.
They should be able to hear you as you're speaking.
He can hear me. Manju, why don't you speak?
European composer, academician, books in the background. So I was
Hey folks, sorry to interrupt your conversations, but if we could be in this general vicinity, these 5 rows in the center, so that this little camera can pick everybody's faces up. And honestly, it's a wonderful pleasure of seeing your face as you get to see his. That would be fantastic. One other announcement while I have your attention. If anyone is parked in a parking space on campus other than the Alumni House parking lot, we've made a little bit of a faux pas. You may have a campus parking ticket. If when you get back, we have 2 options. We can wait and leave your car there, the ticket isn't going to get worse. And you can fill out one of these forms, the top part of this form, and sign it, and I will file it for you, and we'll get it removed and waived. Or you can hand me your keys now and tell me where your car is located, and I can move it to the street in front of our I will not wash your car or evacuate or polish your The only acceptable parking spaces are in the...
I was ready to make a move. Are you back with us?
Okay, back. I think he was at a
Hey, Johannes. I think they're ready.
I cannot see Manju.
the gestures that are meaningful are more.
Now see you.
I think my project, what I want to do is much more simple.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. And we actually quite fortunate to have Johannes join us from England. I think some of you may
State, or maybe in Houston, or maybe through ADAPT that he was part of, 15, 20 years ago, Johannes. And he is now at Brunel, and he's the chair of theater and the professor of performance technologies. And I asked him to join us because I wanted to hear his opinion on the general state of things. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on all over the world in terms of dance and music. And now that we have a lot of tools to share information with and talk to each other, like we're doing now with Johannes, who is, it's 7 p.m. there now in England, and he's been kind enough to join us late in the evening. But we have these tools, and we are able to share this, and we already know that we have all these tools. The question is that I initially, when I posed to Johannes the title, asking if there's a global identity, a unified, he said, what global identity? And I said, that's precisely what I want to talk about. What are your thoughts? How do you feel? In fact, there is so much going on in every location all over the world in terms of modern dance and music. Now that we have the tools, is there a sort of a move towards maybe a thought process, thinking, an idea, ideology? So these are questions that I just want to have him chat about. We'll chat about with him. We'll all get a chance to ask him some questions. And Johannes is also going to talk about his work at Brunel in performance technologies, and also in his lab, the DAP lab. And also, just to note here, Brockwood already has a study abroad program with Brunel University. So it might be a way of Brockwood dance majors to, in the future, if they choose to go through, maybe work with Tamara and set up sort of maybe an exchange program for a semester and so on. Johannes, welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. And good afternoon to everyone. I'm really sorry I missed the earlier session. Yeah, is William Moulton there? Was it a good talk?
It was brilliant, I thought.
I'm really sorry I could not listen because Tamara, of course, forgot to send me the link of the live stream, and it only came a few minutes ago. But you probably already laid the foundation for this conversation between Manju and me, so it should be easy to follow up.
Well, Bill is, I found out that Bill decided to speak a little later, even though he feels he speaks all the time. And he has, and I want to tie it in with what he was saying. But I'm going to go with the lessons he's taught me, and I'm going to walk off of that from years ago. Basically, we are talking about the global identity of Western theory in music and in dance. A global identity, but of the Westerness of Western. And you over there in Europe, what you see and the work you do and what you're seeing. And we'll tell you what we see and what we notice here, because we all come from different locations in the United States. We all deal with different faculty, students of different backgrounds who are coming in with different ideas. And given that technology has actually has created more upheaval at the moment than has been a calmness, because we are aware of everything that's going on all over the place. So I'll leave with that and have you jump in and give us a chat. Tell us what you think.
Well, it's not easy to immediately say something brilliant, because I really would want to know more of the context in which you all work, and to what extent your work in music or in dance relates intricately to the use of new technologies. And it's not something we talk about much here, namely whether these technologies are global, whether we all share the same, whether we use different techniques and technologies, and above all, whether in the collaboration between musicians and performers, we share a common understanding of what it is we're actually doing in the building of a piece. For example, if you take such key ideas as composition or choreography, it would, of course, then require us to ask are you here in the audience? Are you composers? Or are you sound artists, programmers, and live improvisation artists who perhaps, if you think of working in real time and with certain kinds of interactive tools, yeah, we can change the focus from composition to something else. And then I would ask, what is this else? Yeah, what is this new combination of real-time processes that can be happening in the movement, and it can be happening in the sound generation? So I think I personally am returning to ideas of composition after having worked for 10 years with interactive devices that for me have been disappointing. And yet, I guess, Manju, you can perhaps raise the question, what kind of tools or instruments are some of us working with? And you know, I have worked in the US and in Europe, and I think the dance technology field, as I saw it emerging, and I think I was participating in it because it excited me. My first workshop was in 1994 in Amsterdam. By the time I came to OSU, Ohio, it was the turn of the millennium, and OSU asked me to instigate an MFA in dance technology. But I think I was at that point, even though you would think so, media and technology had a presence, a continuing presence for years. Electronic music has been for years. But when I came to OSU, to a modern dance department, it was still a radical step for them to let me schlep microphones and cameras and infrared sensors stuff into a studio and hook people up with wires or ask them to consider rehearsing with me under a set of motion capture cameras. It was so new to us still that the language of dance and science, dance and technology, or music technology and dance technology was still creating a lot of, I think, consternation. And I stop here. Perhaps we have to go back to the question of our physical practice. I heard you had a dance class this morning, yeah? How does the physical practice gel with our finding new tools all the time? And I think we should talk about tools. But global identity, that is a very difficult concept which I cannot answer offhand because I don't believe in such a thing. I think we are always involved in particular situated practices. Rockport, Ohio, London, yeah, Tokyo, Melbourne. It's going to be different, even though dance vocabularies have traveled and crossed over, and of course there are common languages. In technology, I never really asked myself to what extent Western technology, let's say technology that's generated by our Western companies in North America, or Canada, or Australia, or in Europe, how they, once they get sent to Latin America or to Chile and Guatemala, how they're being adopted there. Now, obviously, the Japanese have been producing stuff for many decades, so we've been adopting stuff from Japan. Also musically, sonically, in terms of, let's say, the movement of noise music and glitch music, yeah? So there is a lot of meeting points, but I think the workshops I was able to teach in Latin contexts, or when I traveled to Istanbul, or to Portugal, or to Eastern Europe, we were always finding ourselves in new and complex situations where nothing was taken for granted. In terms of knowledge of tools and approach to creation.
Let me, I'm going to interject 2 points so that you can go from there further. One is my colleagues are all, they all work in academia, they're in dance, but they're all musicians, and all their foundational trainings are in Western musical theory. But they're all, almost all of them are aware of the history of what has happened in the last 100 years in terms of concert dance. We have had the labs, we have had the evolution of modern dance, postmodern dance, and within those contexts, we have seen that medium serve as a lab for a lot of us to do our own experiments in music and sound within the context of dance, because dance actually, for me, has been the best lab, if you will, to run my experiments on. So my colleagues, we are all aware that the root of Western musical thought is rooted in Western musical theory. However, with new directions in music comes new theories, new adaptabilities, new tools, new technologies, and a lot of our colleagues are adapting to that while still holding true to the foundation of Western musical theory. And what we are dealing with now is dance, in my opinion, has been at the forefront of multidisciplinary explorations for the last 50, 60 years. In pop culture, we are now becoming very caught up in multidisciplinary concepts that there is a clash of histories where from the outside, the dance world is going, wow, look at all this technology. And when some of us, because we've been in dance, say, well, it's been part of dance for a very long time, what are we doing with these tools? Not let's look at the flash of technology, but how are we sharing information? So there you go, 2 points. My colleagues who are here, what they work with, and the concept of, there's a question if you want to accommodate a question quickly from the audience.
Actually, my question is to you, Manju. What are these tools we're referring to?
Oh, the tools. The tools as musicians.
Yeah, maybe we should mention examples, yeah.
The tools in the last 20 years will go from hardware synthesizers, MIDI, development of MIDI, from MIDI to open sound control, which now you can share information through networks. We can go to sensor technology, wired and wireless sensor technology. We can go into sound samples, generating sound. But briefly, this is your question, John?
Okay.
What do you mean by tools?
No, I didn't know if you were referring to tools of creation or communication about
I'm gonna
finding
consider-
out about what other people
Other
are
people
doing
are
in terms of dance creation.
When I talking about tools, we have tools we use for our work in terms of
Okay.
creating, and we use tools in terms of sharing information and listening to information. And the reason is that we have more tools for communication than we've ever had in the past. And the question is, what are we doing with them, as opposed to look how shiny and nice they are. And I have an iPad, I have an iPhone, and so on. And we have staff, we have colleagues who use traditional analog instruments, percussion to piano, to guitars, to cellos, to some who use interfaces, MIDI, motion tracking software. We have bend sensors that we use. We have Arduino. We have, you can get into all that. So all this is happening, and you know that, and we know that. But I feel that we're spending a lot of time on that. Like, wow, look at all this, look at all that. That's my opinion. So where do you think, how do you deal with when you come across collaborations and technology and artists and music and working with music and that? Are you able to negotiate collaborations and get to the crux of what you want to achieve? If you want to go from.
Okay, I mean, you introduced or you mentioned your colleagues in the guild or in the field of music. Am I to understand this to mean that many of you, or perhaps most of you, come with a background in composition, and that you perhaps used to score music, write music, and that this music was brought to a company making dance? Or are you operating beyond and after this notion of composition in professional contexts where you have to be together with the dancers and the choreographers, and perhaps the movement is developed together with the development of the sound. And for me, which I will maybe talk about in the second half, I no longer use any scores or any pre-recorded music at all. Yeah, none. All the sound in the dance is generated on stage, not necessarily by musicians, although we have performers, both dancers and musicians, but also by the dancers who use some of the technologies that you mentioned to generate sound. And now, having worked like this for 2-3 years with a much greater interest in sound than ever before, I'm of course running into certain questions, for example, regarding complexity and also the multimodality of all the instruments I'm using on stage. Yeah? A lot of my work is heavily multimedia, so it involves dance, theater, and film in conjunction with the sonic materials that we generate. So the sonic experience or the sound choreography is experienced together with digital media. And I think this makes it all very complicated because I look at the history of, let's say, film in dance or video in dance as a substantial long history, decades, in which choreographers knew there is such a thing as film, yeah? And filmmakers or choreographers made dance films or used projection. But how is projection used? And how is the visual projection part of a choreography of sound or a sonic choreography? And these are very complicated questions because I think the visual and the oral are different from one another. And so I think the notions of composition are coming back to me through the visual media I use. But I am learning right now, and mind you, I'm a theater maker, yeah, so I'm not a composer. I actually lack some of the knowledge you have, but I'm very interested in the role that the sound process plays within the experience of the movement, both for the dancer and for the audience. So currently I'm working more with installations where the audience moves in between us, and I'm interested in very subtle, small noises and sounds. And perhaps we need to mention the word noise because I work with a lot of analog stuff, so I'm going back a little bit to look at what comes before the digital. And the things our dancers wear are often older technologies, they make noise. And because I noticed that when you have a bend sensors and you use some kind of a patch with it that allows pitch bending, it's not that interesting in terms of the dance and in terms of the music result. So I think interactivity, maybe we should look at it briefly, very critically. And some of the softwares have been now used by, I guess, music composers and dance composers for a while. Let's say Max MSP or PD. How far have we moved to make it artistically really powerful? Also in terms of how it affects perhaps new ideas of dance experience. And to come back and then finish to the global, what I of course learned as a theater dance artist over the years is I learned new knowledge through the collaboration with others, and my traveling a little bit outside of my home, to places where I was invited, meant that I had to become also a kind of ethnographer. And I'm wondering whether there are ethnomusicians and ethnomusicologists amongst us, because obviously if you now look at, I have this little book here that I started to read. It's difficult. It's by a Singaporean fellow, Marcus Tan, and it's about intercultural listening, acoustic interculturalism. And he looks at certain processes when you say have a Chinese director adopting Western text to make Chinese Western music theater, compared to, let's say, Peter Brook taking Indian sacred epos, making Mahabharata as if it was a Shakespearean universal stuff, yeah? And we all know that Shakespeare is not universal, he's British, and it comes from a particular historical context. So this whole notion of universal language is immediately attacked when Peter Brook comes to India, yeah? In the same way in which we can look at Orientalism and reverse Orientalism, Occidentalism, Marcus Tan calls it, to see how we appropriate from another, to generate interesting new dance languages and also sonic, I think, worlds. Yeah. So when you say global identity, doesn't world music now have a negative connotation? Aren't we critical of world music?
Yes. Well, I think, you know, the term world music was, on a lack of a better word, we spoke of music in the 80s. I think that was the introduction to even the Western, with Peter Gabriel's sound score for Last Temptation of Christ, was one of the first times that a piece of music in pop culture exposed the Western world or to the American world to a lot of for global artists. And even though way before that we've had pockets of introductions of music from different parts of the world, Peter Gabriel's Last Temptation of Christ was in many facets how global music, and then his whole label became, you know, global music. But I think we are now a global society, as at least it is being. And
We are, and,
yes.
and I'm not sure if I'm now addressing you up there in New York. From my experience back in Europe before I emigrated, I want to mention briefly the example of Pina Bausch. Quite difficult for me to see how early Bausch became late Bausch, because after the 80s, she got increasingly invited to make co-production in different locations. So she would go to Sicily, or to Sao Paulo, or to Tokyo, or to Los Angeles, and she would make a new piece, and she would then use a string of found music, both Western, non-Western, and string it together, chain, yeah? And I never quite knew how to analyze that, how she makes these decisions, which music goes here, yeah? Where do the African percussion go compared to the folk song, yeah, from Sicily? And what I wanted to ask is, if we live in a global world and you look at your dance studio, is your group of dancers an international group? Like here in London, it's quite multi-ethnic, and in my Dabbler, I have dancers from China, from Japan, from Italy, from Spain, from England, and from, you know, a whole range of different backgrounds, and therefore they are trained in somewhat different cultural languages. And so this is, first of all, a challenge to combine, because I don't teach technique, yeah? I only work with the dancer's creativity, what they bring to us. And so each individual is an individual in a collective. And then I work with sound artists who listen to the dancers. I'm hoping the dancers listen to what is generated in rehearsal. And here we come back to the tools. These are generative tools, I think. A software that allows the sound artist to process what is picked up by microphones or sampled, and then stretch or contort or shift or multiply the data that are being generated. And this is not necessarily a Western idea. It could be a Brazilian concept of anthropophago, cannibalism. You take what comes and you eat it, and as you swallow, something is happening. Or in terms of bringing these different parts of the meal together. Manju, do you consider this a globalizing thing, or why are you worried about it?
Well,
It's okay. I mean, it is inevitable. It is inevitable. The question is, of course, artistically, what is the outcome of your globalizing performance? Is it interesting?
well, I've been wondering, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it would take 4 weeks for a response for me to get back from halfway across the world.
Yeah.
So we had pockets of isolation, of development of theories, philosophy, culture, society.
We were in our villages, yes.
We were in our villages. Now I can do it in a second. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting story. When I first got here, when I had to get my fingerprints done for my student visa, they told me I used ink and we used a piece of paper, and they said, well, we're going to mail it to the State Department. They'll get it in 2 weeks. And by the time they go through the letter, it will be 3 months later they'll get to your envelope, we'll process it and get back to you. When I became a citizen a few years ago, I put my finger on a scanner, and they said, well, the State Department has your fingerprints right now.
Yes.
Right.
It's faster and
Right.
hasn't solved.
So coming back to dance. and
Hasn't
our
solved the
world-
problem. Yeah.
And our world, coming back to dance in our world, we concurrently had a European school of movement and an American school of modern movement. But now technology has changed the way we share information, the way we talk, the way we discuss, the way we tell each other what we are doing. I feel that maybe it's just me, that once we acknowledge what we have and what is tools for communication, to explore our creativity, to use tools to expand on our creativity, that we are still stuck on those tools as opposed to, well, what are we doing with it now?
Well, I see your point, and I hope you don't feel I'm stuck. I mean, I must admit that when interactivity became what looked like a new challenging paradigm, I wrote in my book, Interactivity, and brought the sensors into the studio and so on. But after a few years, I became bored with them, and I think interactivity is a nice concept. It may also be now used more often in relationship to notions of participation, bringing the audience into a space and making them more involved in what will happen in installations. Whereas I think on the stage, interactivity is artistically bankrupt. I don't like it that much. But I think sensitive techniques of capture and process, of course, are still huge challenges artistically. If you are a sound artist and you are processing the live performance and adding maybe some of your own materials that you have in your library to the like, imagine a lighting designer who only pushes the keyboard of a pre-programmed cueing system. You go from Q1 to Q50, it's terribly boring. I would assume that a lighting artist today would want to create the light also perhaps in the moment. In a sense, if you think of a lighting keyboard, changing perhaps the shades and the emphasis of light while she is listening to the dance. So I think live real-time processes are very complex. So now I have to say, what I also learned is, okay, here's interactivity go, yeah? And suddenly we say to the dancer, hey, you are also now a composer, or you are an instrumentalist, yeah? Here I give you this, sensitive system environment, go in, move, yeah? So the dancer goes in, and as she moves, yeah, this gesture controls certain data. So the dancer suddenly realizes, oh, this gesture changes the timbre of the sound. Now the dancer maybe was not trained to be a composer, so needs to learn this. Or maybe we go back to Dalcroze and the kind of education of dance and music and rhythm where it's all one. But I think dancers come with a high knowledge of the body, and I think to ask them to make sound is a new proposition, at least in my limited horizon. I'm not sure whether the dancers over in your school, whether they have to study music.
Yes.
They should, but I mean, they have often. And so I think the collaboration between dancer as instrumentalist and software programmer or composer opens new questions. Namely, can the dancer now work with the sound artist in ways that the two really develop a fine, sensitive understanding of the system? And mind you, we have to talk about system environments, yeah? If we're talking technology. We have to talk about how a performer can act in this habitat and change the states or state phases or whatever you call it of certain things that you hear. And also how the dancer processes this information, yeah? If it's not rhythmic, if it's not melodic, if it's not harmonic, yeah? What if it's total noise? How does the dancer continue concentration? And in my work, which we can show a few slides in a moment, the costumes are meant to distract the dancer from moving in normal ways. So the dancer is also challenged to find a new language to move in some of these costumes and be very careful in how, let's say if you have a microphone in your sleeve or on your shoulder, a sensor in your hip. Can you bring the first slide up? Is that possible at all?
Yes.
If it's possible, number one. Because I realize, my friends in Brockport, you probably haven't seen my work, so I apologize. It has not toured widely. So at least I brought you some still images to see the relationship of the performer to the environment.
Just let me know which slide you want me to throw.
Number one, Valhalla. I thought as someone born in Germany, I should have a small reference to Wagner. So this is a piece that we did in 2006 in Germany, which tried to understand the solo dancer as a person who would be, in a way, controlling through the body all the visual elements of the projections. And we had a triptych projection of a kind of a world that both implied a kind of game environment that sometimes would flip into real, actual urban places, because we had cameras in 4 European cities, and sometimes the constructed virtual world became actual urban territories. And the dancer was deciding what we would be moving through an array of sensors built into her costume, from shoulder to arm to elbow to foot, yeah? And it took months of rehearsal, and it was a nightmare. And we performed it several times in Greece. It was quite nice, but complicated. And we also never knew whether the sensors would be working. So, next slide, please. Is that okay, Manu?
Oh, yes.
I then realized, oh, okay, the film and the visual projection I feel excited by, but I need to understand more the musical side. And I worked with a composer in the next two pieces. And so the night you're looking at is Porco Carne e Spirito, created with Brazilian composer Paulo Chagas. He's now teaching at University of California, Riverside. Paulo makes a score, yeah? So I was doing the visual movement for a scored piece, string quartet, percussion, 3 voices. And it helped me to reacquaint myself with the notion of really precise motivation for instruments and for voices. And it was for me a good learning experience. So just show slide 2 and 3. The choreography of the films was based on paintings by Francis Bacon. And now we're moving to my work with my company now. So the 4th slide, please. I'm showing you a few of the costumes that we're using for the dancers, and they are all in a way influencing the movement because they have small things attached to them, yeah? Sensors, microphones, speakers, and therefore we are trying to, you can go through the next 4 or 5 slides, yeah? You see a slide of a woman with a red pied dress. You see a woman in an organic dress made of ginkgo leaves, but inside the leaves is a sensor. You see a woman with dysfunctional loudspeakers, but also functional microphone, and she plays a record with a microphone, which generates noise. You see a woman that has speakers along her spine on the back of the costume, and it's quite a heavy leather collar, and she has to move very carefully because the speakers are tethered to the amp. And we like the fact that cables can be part of the movement, yeah? The next 2 slides are factory woman and instrument woman, and also you saw the woman with the loudspeakers. She, in a way, she becomes a loudspeaker because she carries the speakers with her in a pose of a worker woman in a rice field, yeah? And what we learned is that in an installation environment, when you shift emphasis from one character to the next, and you let the audience follow individual sounds generated by individual dancers, it creates a wonderful atmosphere in the space, because the audience is not having one perspective or one way of listening to where the sound comes, but the sound is coming from different places. And sometimes it's micro sound, and sometimes it becomes a bit more noise, and sometimes it might have some harmonic vibrational dimension. And so this is what we're working on at the moment. Can you go to, I just want to go through them and then we can continue our dialogue. Can you go slide 10, Bourdon? This is a French dancer working with me in a summer laboratory. We built small microcircuits with their own loudspeakers. And so her wrists become self-generating sound arms. And I must say the sound is not very beautiful, but she's working with it as now part of her movement, yeah? And now my current production, slide 12 and further, is a radio art examination of futurist opera by the Russians, yeah? Victory Over the Sun, 1913, and we are trying to look back to communist revolution as also a revolution of futurist thought in new languages. And so one dancer is wearing Tatlin's tower on the head, and I wished I could just, play a little bit of this tower, because it has a spiral in the top. And this spiral makes noise through a sensor she manipulates on the finger. And you're going to hear this a little bit now. So it's a metallic sound, and basically it's a metallic spiral construction that the dancer has to wear on the head. And it's a delicate movement challenge because she can't really do a lot of energetic movement. She has to be much more of a careful Buto dancer. And we had just been in Japan, and we had been really we were terribly inspired by our Buto masters there. We trained with Buto masters, and we felt perhaps the slower approach to movement coming from Buto allows a greater concentration on the sound production. So if you see some of the other slides, these are costumes inspired by the constructivists, each of them involved in a particular scene that has a narrative base, but also an abstract dimension. And the final slides are about a duet between a dancer who wears a microphone in the shoulder and a Japanese flutist who is trying to work in the duet with her instrument to the microphone. And then the sound artist is processing what we capture between the two and hopefully building on the flute sound and adding textures to it and making that part of the larger compositional spectrum. Now, may I bring the word composition back? And I want to show you another book. It's just come out here in Britain. The contents is heavily, I think, focused on Germany and Greece. And it's called Composed Theater. And the two editors are David Rösner and Matthias Rebstock. And this notion of composed theater does not mean music composed for theater. It means composing live performance in the process of the interdisciplinary collaboration between sound artists, dancers, actors, musicians, designers, software programs. As they are in a process of development, they, in a sense, create the compositional thinking for a particular choreography. And Heiner Goebbels is one of the composers involved in the book, and I don't know whether you've heard of his recent installation. It's called Stifters Dinge. It's a thing that sits there and just performs by itself. It's quite amazing. And it generates its internal processes. And I'm interested in this notion of a composed theater if we are now thinking back of this notion of collaboration in real time. I stop here.
Okay, good. One of the things, Johan, is that tying in with collaboration that I'm thinking about now is that I really feel that there are tourists and there are anthropologists. And this is also a little controversial in the sense that
Yeah, both are colonial.
yes,
Both are colonialists.
can't escape it. Okay, is that I really feel that to approach collaborations or multidisciplinary identity dance, that I really feel that we need to look at these relationships through the context of dance as opposed to systematic situational relationships. Because you and I both know we can bring a group of people in together to work on something that has a beginning and an end date, and then we move on, as opposed to dance where it is inherently a multidisciplinary art form, where the soundscape is a inherently built relationship. And therefore you're looking at musicians now who actually work in movement, not in systematic situational moments, but who are becoming aware of the vocabulary of the body or the moving body. Now, is there a difference?
You mean composers or musicians
Composers.
looking carefully at the movement development?
Yes, and as an underlying thread, where the performances are actually visible indicators of, hey, look, this is what I'm doing, and then you disappear. But you're tied into that permanent, ongoing relationship of thinking in different dimensions. Now, I think a lot of my colleagues here are very unique in the sense, in our work, we think in 4 dimensions. We think of time with depth and height in our compositions or in our creative process, which for me at least, is a different way of thinking than other musicians who can be brought into a situational collaboration, which you have of course worked with musicians like that. But I'm thinking more now, is there a shift? Should there be a shift in looking at this relationship from the dance context, where the soundscape is a permanent part of the relationship?
Now you're rephrasing somewhat confuses me, because I think you were initially saying that you don't compose anymore and walk away. You don't give people something that's finished.
No.
So the sound person, composer, is with the dancers. And can I ask you how you understand the term soundscape? Because for me that's a very difficult term. In fact, you mentioned anthropologist. I know an anthropologist in Scotland by the name Ingold, who has written very vehemently against the notion of soundscape, because it confuses us, in analogy to landscape, as something that might be considered fixed if it's recorded, yeah. Whereas I think he's arguing, his name is Ingold, we experience sound by moving through the world, and we are in a way always moving, and like in the air, we are hearing the vibrations of sound, and so we are being ensounded. So the sound, in fact, cannot be escaped. It's always a living weather, like John Cage would say, it's weather. And this notion of dancing with weather, this is something that the Buto people in Japan have actually developed. It's a weather technique by Min Tanaka. And when you go to Min Tanaka in Japan, you have to live on his farm and work in the field. And then in the evening you dance. Yeah? You work, you dance, you're always part of the natural cycle. And you are sharpening attention to the body experiencing environment. So I would say the sound people with the dancers working in this common environment need to both listen to each other. And I think composers today, I would think, in progressive companies like William Forsythe and others, they don't consider dancers people who carry out instructions. They are co-authors of a new piece. So when you work with microphones and movement, or with movement and costumes, or movement and, you are always inviting the dancers to contribute to the overall process of composed theater.
No, I've told some of my
And
students,
do you agree?
I agree with you, but I tell some of my students to think of these terms, and I compare as dancers. I tell them, okay, you're a dancer, but but you don't have a choice to deny the soundscape. It is part of your art.
Yeah, you will hear, yes.
As far as musicians, we have a choice to work with movement or not. At least in the Western concept, the Western aesthetics, we have a choice. Hence, there are musicians who do not work with movement.
But who makes the soundscape, Anju?
Now, I refer to the soundscape generally as the oral entity that we are exposed to in our work.
Okay.
And given the new directions in music and what's happened in the last few hundred years, we add on to what we define as music. At least that is my theory, is that it allows us to add more things to what we define as music.
Because some of you, of course, will remember John Cage working with Cunningham. Cunningham would be developing something, and then Cage would arrive and would have microphones there and pour some water into a glass and maybe turn on some radios. And somehow there would be these layers, perhaps, of sound that were generated, and the dancers did not know beforehand, right?
Well, I have a point here. Those are just visible indicators of what Cage was already doing with dance before he made Merce with Bonnie Bird and all that. So
Yeah.
Cage and Cunningham, by the time they got to New York, and mainstream music thinks they met in New York, where we know that he was a musician in the dance class, he was one of us. And
Yeah.
Cunningham knew that Cage had an idea of movement vocabulary, which differentiates musicians who work in dance and those who don't. So when they did this work in New York, the underlying thread, they knew the underlying thread. It just wasn't a visible indicator in their work. Because they were
And
able
you-
to go off of that.
And you mentioned to me that composers, sound artists, and performers and performance makers maybe need to share more, of maybe not so much understanding of tools and technologies. That's less interesting than maybe a philosophical understanding of what kind of movement are we using, what kind of things are we hearing. So this notion of audible sound
Yeah.
and audible, I'm working on something called audible choreography, how we hear choreography. That's, I think, a challenge of the near future, that we really, in a sense, focus our research on how a performance company experiences sound and also shares this with an audience. You may have seen dance tech or music tech events where something is happening and you're not sure why it's happening. And you know, audiences sometimes are curious about causes and effects, which I think is awful if they become really nervous about what causes this sound, yeah? So what have we learned from the acousmatic tradition, and what have we learned from, let's say, moving in darkness and maybe re-sensitizing yourself to listening, feeling space, exploring perhaps the intent, and then if you are working as a dancer instrumentalist, you have something on your body that amplifies body. Then I think again it takes rehearsal time and conceptual understanding of how the body is amplified and how the body amplifies the sound of the space. Yeah.
Is that where are we moving towards that?
Well, I think I don't know. Have you guys heard of this madman from Australia, who's my colleague here, Stellark?
Yep, I still have.
He was just telling me yesterday that he really thinks the body is so obsolete that it needs to be really constantly propped up. Biotechnologically, soon we can replace the less functional organs, and he's working with rapid prototyping of new ambidextrous hands, where fingers can go in all directions, and is just being prototyped. And you know, he likes to have 3 arms and 4 ears, so I'm not saying biologically we're moving into a new era, but we're all going to be living longer. Yeah, Anju, you and I, we have a long time to go.
Some people may not be happy to hear that.
And therefore, this question of the extensibility of the body is a powerful, I think, question. Also, if the body is more of a kind of multi-modal instrument. Yeah?
Johannes, I want to interject something right here about, and this is to tie in with what Stellark is doing. And he has been saying this for a while, that the body is obsolete. And I disagree with that, because without the body, there is no technology. You can't deny the body, because the body generates the concepts and the ideas behind the technology. So I've always disagreed with that concept. He does amazing work, and I like his work. It makes you think and explore. However, you can't deny the body, which is where I disagree with it. Yeah.
And I don't think actually he does. And when he injured himself not too long ago, he was quite aware, of that subjective body, which normally he doesn't really bring into the discussion. He always refers to the body in the third person as it was a kind of an instrument that could, because an instrument, if it has only 5 fingers, but it might be nice to have 10, it can be expanded. And I think notions of expansion may also be philosophical notions, spiritually or mentally. We expand our understanding of movement or being in the world. And I think the collaboration between scientists and us artists is very, very provocative. And I remember when I came to England, it was still in the early days, and Michelle, my design partner, we went to the engineering department and we said to some of the engineers, would you please build us a small wireless transmitter that we can put on the dance? So they came with this box, and it was like this big, yeah? And it was impossible to put into a sleeve, yeah? So it was interesting that the engineer had no understanding of how the dancer would wear this, because the engineer hadn't asked himself that question. Yeah? So if you want to work with wearable sonic instrumentation, we need to talk to the engineers, or we ourselves need to build elegant things. Now, this summer, my young members of the company arrived to the summer lab, and he has this new thing in his hand called Leap Motion. I said, oh. So he played all summer with this Leap Motion, and so far it's not doing very much to me, but he looks now more like a conductor. I see him constantly in the corner, he's conducting something on his on this little device. And it will change this young man, because eventually he will discover he really wanted to be a conductor. We should invite the audience.
Yes.
He showed us earlier, right?
Because it's very late.
Get the author's name.
Yes. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to let my colleagues join in. They all want to ask questions.
Yes, of course, and we're starting late, so we need to let the audience come in.
Yes. So.
How was the dance class this morning?
Okay, I want to briefly touch on that, because my observations from that is to see my colleagues who work with movement vocabulary, to see them touch and connect. Okay, the concept of trance. I grew up with trance.
You did trance?
Well, trance.
You Sufi man.
No, my family feels I wish I had gotten some trance because I was removed. Yeah, I didn't have enough. But the concept of ethnic worlds, the South Asian traditions and Africanist traditions of that the magic that happens, I see in a modern class or a ballet class simply because there is an actual sharing of each other's environment. My colleagues know the dance world. Peter Gabriel doesn't. And when I watch my colleagues work, I see this magic starts building and building, and I sense shivers up and down my spine, because I think the paradigm of seeing where true artistic sharing in the Western aesthetic form of dance and music happens when musicians who are aware of the dance vocabulary are creating with that in their consciousness. But that's, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and again, here we ought to draw on this so-called global development because, at least in my context, both in Texas and here, we had friends in the Latin community and in Afro-Caribbean community. So when I look at the Afro-Caribbean dancers and musicians, it seems like it's a given that the musician is performing with dance in mind, with movement in mind. Yeah, and now in terms of technology, this harmony or this philosophical, spiritual harmony, I don't think exists yet, but
it does, and it's preposterous. I'm going to suggest right now, it doesn't exist in situational collaborations. It existed in the classes my colleagues played for today, and I'll leave it at that. And I'll let them speak. And
it's enough.
Can you give the author and citation of the composing theater, because I can't find it on
I'm so sorry. They are both the German blokes. David Rösner and Matthias Rebstock.
Okay. And the previous book.
Published in England by Intellect, Marcus Cheng Xie Tan.
foreign names. Foreign names.
The young man from Singapore now happens to teach in Dublin, Ireland. Isn't that funny? Acoustic interculturalism. That's a very nice title, isn't it? And I think what he's also proposing is that if we look at intercultural or transcultural production, performance, we tend to look very often at the theatrical values and movement and performance qualities, but we seldom analyze the acoustic things that are happening when there is a fusion or juxtaposition of say Eastern and Western musical instruments or musical concepts. And
So
questions, comments or criticisms. I'm sorry that it's so hard for me now to be physically able to see you closer, but the camera is on the auditorium and you have a microphone?
Yes, they can speak, it'll be picked up.
Okay.
It's very inspiring to hear, as it always is, to hear about what you are doing and to hear, from my colleagues, as I begin to hear what each of us is doing in these areas. Everything is very disparate. Everybody finds their own way to make these things happen. But it always occurs to me that, the musician has always, for the last however many hundreds of years, been glued physically to a space. And the dancer is free, is liberated in space. And we also can begin to think about training a new kind of creator who is one person who is both composer and dancer, who can, now that we have the ability, let's really create a detailed situation where a human being can move through space and in a very particular way, trigger sounds that are not just like DJ kind of sounds or sound washes, but can achieve the same kind of pitch creation, detail, all those things, and soundscape that a composer would sitting at a table, but would be free, because we're all getting fat and ugly sitting at our instruments.
Speak for yourself. I think you're quite right, and I don't know how this is progressing in terms of let's say, composers who are also perhaps performers and instrumentalists, because in a way, you can place the instrumentalist on stage or in music theater, make the instrumentalist performer a character, yeah? And there are certain, and I have never studied fully what happened in music theater in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but some of it looked to me like, oh God, who are some of the protagonists of this work? When they, in a sense, theatricalized music, yeah? But today, I remember mentioned perhaps possibilities of new devices. I saw a concert by Atao Tanaka where he walked on stage with 2 iPhones in his hands, and he had everything programmed or whatever, and he was doing it, and he performed with these iPhones, and was really doing a hand dance while he was playing his samples. And I think there are interesting challenges now for composers to become more involved in the movement, and this should begin always with the warm, because I typically, when I have software people with me, they always sit behind the laptop and refuse to take part in the warm-up.
Right. Right.
Yeah? Why is that?
We are caught up in the glitz, the playing of the tools as opposed to the information.
And have you heard of the, well, I'm sure it's been in the United States, of course, laptop music. I remember one concert by a guy from Berlin. Oval is his name. He stood on the stage on his laptop and didn't look up the entire evening. He just looked down in his software. Had no physical connection to the audience. And I thought, this is very odd. Yeah? When you, in a way, become stoned.
It isn't that odd. I just, if you watch Andreas Schiff play a Bach concert, he never looks at the audience.
Well, you
So
can
it's not
always
really that
interject
odd.
and say, well, what about desktop musicians? What happened to them? Well, they couldn't leave their house. Laptop musicians could leave their house.
Well, this is the global thing. When I started to work in telematics, we at one point we thought, okay, so now we will connect it with everyone, everywhere. But have some of you tried telematic music concert between 2 cities? It's not easy. And once we moved the dancers into the studio with the cameras, we had to invent a whole new way of filming them with the cameras. It was very exciting, actually, but very, very cumbersome.
Johannes, one more question. Questions?
Well,
Are there any dancers in the audience?
There are some.
We're all dancers.
So, very highly skilled.
We are dancing.
yes, I have a jillion comments, but I think the most recent experience I've had, I was just in Tokyo working with some Butoh dancers and with my dancers in Illinois simultaneously, and I think there is some sort of global identity that is gradually evolving, because my notion of this new piece I'm working on is with
thank you for this comment, and I'm trying to make an intelligent answer. Let me just look at something here. My memory here, it's coming back. Can I use the chat line? Do you see that chat line?
Let me open
To write down a name. Maybe you don't see it.
Yeah.
This is a European conceptual dancer who had the nerve some time ago. I saw some of his early work. It's very interesting. You know, he was a molecular biologist and then became a dancer. But he recently did a performance where he said, Buto dance, you look at it in YouTube, you can learn it in 3 hours. And then he performed his adoption of Buto after 3 hours. But you see, what interests me about your comment is that when you bring together, let's say, dancers trained in Illinois and dancers trained in Buto dance in Japan, I think the understanding of what a gesture is will be radically different. So, and if we're talking about gesture-controlled sound, but the Buto dancer thinks a gesture could be the eyes in my shoulder, yeah? And maybe the way the Buto dancer floats and goes from the inside into a space. You know, Kazuo Ono used to say, you have eyes under your foot, yeah? So where would Kazuo Ono locate the beginning and ending of a gesture? And then if you bring together Buto dancer and Western modern dancers, you will have two cultures on the same stage, no?
Yes.
Not one. No, not one, two.
But if
I
they're,
think.
if they're dancing, well, in this case, they're sort of dancing this duet, imitating each other. They do appropriate things from each other.
And of course, if we want to achieve more exchange and sharing, then of course they will learn from one another, yeah. And we, as choreographers, also learn from one another. That's true.
So then you do.
And it needs this dialogue and also recognizing our differences within the globalizing pressure, yeah, that's coming from economy and from maybe the consumption and the distribution of technological means. But the spiritual adoption or the mental adoption of a tool, again, could be culture specific, yeah? And I think it's good that we will always run into, my God, how is Guillermo Gomez Peña using this thing, yeah? And he uses it like a Chicano, yeah, in an ironic sense, maybe even exaggerating a certain, ethnic approach to a tool, yeah? I think it's interesting.
one more question. Right.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, he can hear you.
Okay, all right. It's interesting and very valuable, the point that you're just making, because of an experience that I had a few years ago at the University of Minnesota, where Manju and I both taught and lectured and performed. And there was someone from the Wiccan community that approached me and asked me to come to one of their sessions because they wanted to know more about African drumming. And when I went to the session, there was an abundant number of percussion instruments. And they played with vigor and with enthusiasm. And I asked, well, why did they want me to come? They have all that energy going. They said, well, because our society has been demystified. And although we can play rhythmically and enthusiastically, we don't have a language. And you Africans have a very specific language where your music is related to very that is a very continuous fabric. And we want to know more about African music. So my comment is that those of us who've not been demystified have a whole body of language and movement that corresponds in a universe. We haven't fallen off the bus.
That's a beautiful comment, and I always actually, if you don't mind me adding a small anecdote, and I enjoy those rehearsals when we have a member in the dub lab who's of Nigerian descent, and he brings his drum with him on occasion, and we had an Israeli composer working with us, trained at Princeton, who hated it when Olu would bring the drum, because it looked so traditional in a way and unreconstructed. But at the same time, I think when we listen to the drum and we could feel the vibrations, to me, this is as exciting, if not more, than hearing a sine wave and you create on the laptop. But the knowledge behind the drumming, that's what we need, yeah? The cultural knowledge of why certain drums are used and how the movement responds to it or guides it. I have another example, by the way, sir. I met a film music scholar from University of Sussex who had been doing research in Portugal, and he was very mystified by the fact that Carlos Saura made a film on the fado with dancers. And my colleague said, there is no dancing fado. I said, oh, well, okay. So I didn't know what to answer. But Saura has made films on flamenco and tango. Now he made one on fado. And I'm not sure whether there's a fado scholar amongst you, but why wouldn't people be able to dance to the fado?
Well, Bertie Jones did something on fado.
And well, we could discuss so many things if we really go into cultural languages and into knowledge. This Nigerian friend speaks of the tradition of the return beat. I don't know what return beat is, because I never had any exposure to percussion. In Germany, it was forbidden. After the war, it was forbidden.
Not enough colonization.
And national anthems forbidden, yeah, which is good, yeah.
We have 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, yes.
Yeah. And we have more questions.
Please, more political questions.
You're going to need to twist this to oblige yourself, but go ahead. You coined a phrase, at least for me, a few minutes ago, right before your comment, and I just wanted to put it back into the air. You talked about the spiritual dimension of the distribution of the technology, and as you said that, I was thinking about John mentioning the collaboration in Japan and here, and wondering if some of the difficulty or dissatisfaction we feel with these arrangements and the kind of lightness of the cultural exchange is due to the ephemerality of the technology and the fact that we spend very small amounts of time doing these ponderous projects that take so much effort and so much will to make happen at all. We don't really live in them long enough to develop a language, long enough to have any kind of fabric, so we all know instinctively that a language and a fabric is what we long to be part of, but we're dealing with this ponderous situation, and we don't really have the circumstances to even move in that direction with this technology. Politicize,
Yes.
please.
Sorry, are you?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and there's not much to add. I think I do agree with you. I'm older now, in my 50s. I'm not sure how I look upon the sedimentation of tradition, because I also left my culture of birth and I try to become a native of Houston, Texas, yeah? And it was a big change for me, but I have fallen in love with the space, with the landscape, and with the Latin cultural sensuality of the South. And I'm learning to live in that and breathe this, and also I'm listening to Spanish. I'm listening to this language and what it might have meant having been there for many, many generations. And so in a way, technology in the last 10, 15 years for me is almost, it is nerve-wracking, because when I first was brought to the studio and a friend said, here is new camera software called Big Eye. It can see the dancer and then look at what you can do. And then after 1 year, the Big Eye was no longer working on my new Mac. So I had to buy a new software. And every 2 years, someone comes, now they come and say, Johannes, we must work with Kinect camera. I said, yeah, do we? Why? Okay, so we try. I don't really see it enriching my choreographic sensibility, this Kinect camera, so we've already abandoned it. But sometimes you hold on to certain things that become dear to you, yeah? And at the moment for me it's microphone. I am learning to really work with microphones, and it's going to take me many years to become good at it.
Excellent.
You may laugh at me, but I know it is always a difficult chore to do a Skype interview, but it was a great pleasure to be part of your event.
Johannes, thank you so much. Really, thank you. And I'm sure we'll do this again. You're always invited to join us wherever you are. And
Okay,
we'll see you
thank
again.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good conference. Yeah?